Today we are tackling a question that seems, super simple on the surface, but as you're about to find out, it is anything but. The question is, what is morality?
So just think about that for a second. I mean, really, if you had to define it right here, right now, what would you even say? It probably has something to do with right and wrong, good and bad, but can we nail it down any more than that?
Well, here's where we kind of pull the rug out from under ourselves right at the start. It turns out that, according to the source material for this explainer, there's no single, universally agreed-on definition. Yeah, unlike chemistry or math, there's just no simple answer. And that's a really surprising and frankly crucial place for us to begin.
Okay, so if there's no one perfect definition, where do we even start? Well, we start with the answer that probably pops into most of our heads first: morality as a kind of social rulebook. This is what philosophers call conventional morality.
So what is it? Essentially, conventional morality is just what a specific group of people in a particular place and time have all kind of agreed is the right way to behave. It's the set of rules we've created for ourselves so we can all live together. It's basically the "that's just how we do things around here" version of ethics.
And you can see this playing out in the real world all the time. This kind of morality can be wildly different from one society to the next. So in Saudi Arabia, conventional morality has rules about women's public behavior that you just wouldn't find in Denmark. Or take a look at something like tipping. In the US, a lot of people would say it's flat out immoral not to tip a good server. But in so many other countries, that expectation just doesn't even exist. It's all about the local, agreed-upon rules.
And, well, this leads us to the big, thorny question, doesn't it? Just because a rule is popular, just because everyone in a society accepts it, does that automatically make it the right thing to do? Is it possible for an entire society to be morally wrong? This is the point where we have to look past what's just popular. We have to really examine the limits of using convention as our only moral compass.
So why can a society's rulebook be so flawed? Well, because these rules are made by us, by human beings. And let's face it, we are not perfect. Our social agreements can be built on things that have nothing to do with what's truly right. Things like misunderstandings, irrational fears, deep-seated biases, or even just old superstitions. A popular belief is not always a correct one.
So if the social rulebook isn't the whole story, then what is? This brings us to the second huge idea in our explainer, something called critical morality. This is the tool we can use to actually judge those social rulebooks.
Okay, so think of critical morality like a measuring stick that exists outside of what any one society happens to think. It isn't based on a popular vote or tradition. It's a standard that lets us step back and ask, hey, are our society's rules, are they actually fair? Are they just? Are they truly right?
In this table here, it really lays out the difference perfectly. You've got conventional morality on one side. It comes from social agreements. It's about what people believe is right. And boy, is it vulnerable to things like bias and prejudice. But then you have critical morality. It's independent. It's a standard for what is right, and it aims to be totally free from all those human flaws.
All right, so we've got these two big concepts, conventional and critical. But so what? Why does this difference actually matter in the real world? Well, it's all about making the jump from just blindly following rules to actively reasoning about them.
And here is the absolute key takeaway. Without the idea of a critical morality, the very concept of moral progress it falls apart. Makes no sense. We couldn't look back at past societies that practiced slavery or denied women the right to vote and say they were morally wrong. We could only say they were different. Critical morality is what gives us the footing to say, no, we've gotten better because we're measuring ourselves against a higher, more consistent standard. It's what gives us permission to question the way things are and to try to do better.
And that leaves us with a final question to chew on, one that turns the lens right back on us. Now that you can see the difference between what's just popular and what might actually be right, what's a conventional belief, a widely accepted rule in our society today, that you think might not stand up to a more critical look? It's a powerful question to ask, and now you have a framework to start answering it.
Let's be real for a second. When you hear the words philosophy major, what's the first image that pops into your head? Is it someone in a dimly lit coffee shop, probably wearing a turtleneck, debating the meaning of existence? Yeah, we've all been there. But there's a huge, and I mean huge, gap between that stereotype and the actual reality. You've heard the cliches a million times, right? Philosophy majors are basically unemployable. They don't have any real skills for a world obsessed with tech, and they're definitely not going to make any money. That's the story we're all told.
But what if I told you that a whole bunch of data shows every single one of those assumptions is, well, just false, like completely and totally wrong?
So let's start with the biggest myth of them all, the idea that these graduates just can't get a job, because the data tells a very different story. Okay, take a look at this number, 4.3%. Any ideas what this could be? It's not the percentage of philosophy majors who can correctly pronounce Nietzsche on the first try. Nope. It's a number that completely shatters that first big myth. You got it. That's the unemployment rate for recent philosophy grads. And here's where it gets really wild. This number isn't just low, it's actually lower than the national average. And, believe it or not, it's lower than a lot of majors we all think of as the safe, practical choices. And this is where the story gets really interesting. This unemployment rate is lower than for folks who majored in math, economics, and even chemical engineering. Just let that sink in for a second. The so-called useless degree is actually outperforming some of the most respected fields when it comes to landing a job. So, if they're not all becoming professors, where in the world are they going? Well, pretty much everywhere. They're in business consulting firms, they're leading tech teams in Silicon Valley, they're on Wall Street, they're in government, journalism, law, medicine, you name it. They're the people designing things, publishing things, and creating things. All right, so this all brings up a really obvious question, doesn't it? How? I mean, what is it about studying philosophy that sets them up for success in so many different fields? What's their secret weapon? What are they learning that makes them so valuable in careers that seem, completely disconnected from what they studied? Okay, get ready for this. Check out this table of GRE scores. That's the big test for grad school. Philosophy majors, on average, score higher than every single other major on verbal reasoning and analytical writing. That's not a fluke. These students are trained day in and day out to think critically, to take apart complicated arguments, and to write with total precision. And this isn't just about acing a test. We're talking real-world skills. Carly Fiorina, the former CEO of Hewlett-Packard, said her philosophy degree taught her how to separate the wheat from the chaff and how to argue. I mean, come on, those are essential boardroom skills right there. It's the same story in the heart of Silicon Valley. Stuart Butterfield, the guy who co-founded both Slack and Flickr, says his philosophy background gave him the tools to reason about things from the ground up. And that's exactly what you need to be an entrepreneur. It's about learning how to think, not just memorizing what to think. All right, so they get jobs, they've got amazing skills, but I know what you're thinking. What about the money? Let's finally put that starving philosopher stereotype to bed for good. So data from PayScale shows that right out of college, a philosophy major's median pay is solid, around $44,000. But just watch what happens by the time they hit their mid-career. That number skyrockets to over $85,000. Yeah, that's a salary increase of 101%. It's a massive jump. And it tells you everything you need to know about the long-term value of the skills they've built. Now, to put that in perspective, that 101% growth puts philosophy in the top 11% of all majors for salary growth. Their ability to think critically and solve complex problems just becomes more and more valuable as their careers go on. And just look at how they stack up against other fields. By mid-career, they're earning right alongside political science majors, and they're nipping at the heels of civil engineers. They're pulling in more than many other humanities degrees. The numbers just don't lie. But let's be honest, if you're drawn to studying philosophy in the first place, you already know the value isn't just about the paycheck. There's a much deeper bottom line. Because after we've looked at all the job data and all the salary charts, we get to what really matters. The true value here goes way beyond the numbers on a bank statement. For thousands of years, philosophy has been humanity's core tool for figuring things out. It's the practice of asking the biggest questions to help us live a life that's focused on what's true, what's real, and what's valuable. It's more than just a major. It's a way of approaching life. So I'll just leave you with this one question. In a world that's getting more complex by the second, a world that's changing faster than ever, what could possibly be more practical, more valuable, or more future-proof than the simple act of learning how to think? All right, let's dive right in. Today, we are tackling a question that is absolutely fundamental. It shapes our personal lives, our laws, our entire societies, and it's a question that we all feel like we know the answer to, right up until someone actually asks us to define it. So let's do it. I'm asking you, right now, what is morality? We all have this gut feeling about it, right? A sense of right and wrong, good and bad, but pinning down what it actually is, that's where things get surprisingly tricky. And get this, that's a quote from the philosopher Russ Shafer Landeu, whose work is our source for this explainer. And it's kind of a bombshell, isn't it? Even the experts, the people who spend their entire lives thinking about this stuff, don't have one single definition they can all agree on. So if there's no official dictionary entry, how in the world are we supposed to even talk about it clearly? Yeah, that's the big challenge. It can feel like we're totally lost before we even start. But here's the good news. The lack of a perfect, one-sentence definition doesn't mean we're just stuck in the dark. Instead of chasing some elusive, perfect answer, we're going to do something way more practical. We're going to build a toolkit, a set of mental tools that will let us take apart moral questions with some real precision, see the landscape of different arguments, and, maybe most importantly, have way clearer and more productive conversations about all of it. So, let's get started. Okay, first tool out of the box. And honestly, this one might be the most important of them all. It's a pair of lenses that helps us see morality in two completely different ways: conventional morality and critical morality. So let's break this down. On one hand, you've got conventional morality. This is basically just what everybody thinks, the unwritten rules of a society. Tipping your server in the US is a perfect example. It feels wrong not to do it, but that's a social custom, not some universal truth. Now, on the other hand, we have critical morality. This is the standard we're going to focus on. It allows us to stand back and ask the really tough questions, like, hey, is our conventional morality actually, good? Critical morality is the tool we use to challenge the status quo and push for something better. Awesome! We have our lenses. Now let's add the next couple of crucial tools to our kit. We're going to need a map, so we know what part of the moral territory we're in, and we need a solid foundation to build our arguments on so they don't just fall apart. Okay, this is our map. Moral philosophy usually gets broken down into these three big areas. First, value theory. That's all about the destination. What's the goal? A happy life? A meaningful one? Then you've got normative ethics. This is about the path to get there. What are the rules of the road? What makes an action right or wrong? And finally, meta-ethics. This one zooms way, way out and asks about the map itself. Are moral truths even real? Can a moral claim be true or false in the first place? Knowing this helps us figure out what kind of question we're really trying to answer. And this is our foundation. To stop every single moral debate from ending in, well, that's just your opinion, we need some common ground to stand on. These aren't ironclad rules, but they are super plausible, common sense starting points most of us can agree on. Like, intense pointless suffering is bad, or that if you're going to hurt someone on purpose, you'd better have a really good reason. This is what allows us to have a rational discussion instead of just shouting at each other. Our next tool is all about sharpening our focus. Because, sometimes the best way to understand what something is to get really clear on everything it is not. So let's clear away some of the things that get confused with morality all the time. Let's make some really important distinctions here. First step, the law is not the same as morality. Cheating on your partner might be immoral, but it's not illegal. Etiquette isn't morality. Using the wrong fork at a fancy dinner is a social mistake, not a sign of a bad character. Self-interest is not morality. In fact, doing the right thing, like being a whistleblower, can sometimes cost you everything. And this last one is huge. Tradition is not morality. Just because something has been done for a long time, like slavery was, that doesn't make it right, not even close. Okay, the toolkit is built. We've got our lenses, we've got our map, we've got a foundation, and we've cleared out the clutter. Now, it's time for the stress test. Let's use these tools on one of the oldest and most powerful ideas about where morality comes from: religion. So, we're going to zoom in on a specific idea known as the divine command theory. The core of it is pretty simple. Something is good because God says it's good, and something is bad because God says it's bad. Full stop. God is literally the author of morality. On the surface, it sounds pretty solid, right? But let's put our new toolkit to work. This right here is the classic problem, a question that Socrates posed thousands of years ago. It forces us into a corner. Is it option 1? God sees what is already good and tells us to do it, Or is it option 2? Things are only good because God decides they are. The divine command theory plants its flag firmly on option 2. So let's see where that leads. And here's the huge problem that comes up. If things have no moral value until God makes a command, then there are no moral reasons for God's commands. It means God could just as easily have commanded cruelty and forbidden kindness. And if that happened, then according to this theory, being cruel would suddenly become the right thing to do. That makes morality seem totally random, which doesn't really fit with the idea of a morally perfect being. We can actually lay this out as a clear, logical argument. Premise 1, if the theory is true, God could have made cruelty good. That just follows from the theory itself. Premise 2, a morally perfect being just wouldn't do that. It's part of what it means to be perfect. So, if you accept both of those premises, the conclusion is unavoidable. The divine command theory must be false. And notice, this isn't an argument about whether God exists. It's a logical look at the claim that God is the creator of morality. This whole line of thought leads to a fascinating alternative. What if morality is an independent truth, kind of like math? In that case, an all-knowing God wouldn't invent it, but would understand it perfectly. So God isn't the author of morality, but is its ultimate, infallible reporter. God commands kindness because kindness is good, period. So let's just step back and look at the awesome toolkit you've just put together. You've got your lenses to tell the difference between social rules and deeper truths. You've got a map to navigate all the different kinds of moral questions. You have a solid foundation to start your conversations, a sharpener to clear away all the confusion, and a method to logically stress test the biggest ideas out there. And that brings us to the final huge question. We've used our new toolkit to show that morality isn't as simple as following tradition or obeying the law or even just listening to divine commands. We've cleared away all the easy answers, and that leaves us staring right at the biggest question of them all, the one this toolkit now gives you the power to explore for yourself. If morality is a real, independent standard, where on earth does it come from? All right, let's jump right in. We're about to build ourselves a toolkit for thinking. You know, a set of really essential tools that'll help you construct a rock-solid argument. And maybe even more importantly, help you spot a weak one from a mile away. Now, I know what you're thinking. That sounds like a riddle, right? A total contradiction. But believe me, getting your head around this one idea is probably the most important step you can take to becoming a sharper, more critical thinker. So let's unpack it. Okay. First things first, we have to kind of reset our everyday definition of a word we use all the time, argument. See, in philosophy, an argument isn't about people yelling or trying to win a fight. Nope, it's something much more structured, much more, well, calm. And that's really all it is. An argument is just a chain of thought laid out for everyone to see. It's a structure that shows exactly how you got from your starting points, we call those premises, to your final point, the conclusion. It's like the blueprint for your reasoning. Think about it like building a house. To make it strong, you need two things, right? You need good materials, no rotten wood, and you need a good design, a solid blueprint. Well, reasoning is exactly the same. You need to start with true beliefs. Those are your materials, and you need to connect them with flawless logic. That's your blueprint. If either one of those is off, the whole thing just falls apart. So let's see how this actually works. Whenever you hear an argument, you can basically run two different tests on it. One test is for the materials. Are the reasons actually true? And the second test is for the design. Is the logic that holds it all together any good? And this is a really, really common trap. You can listen to an argument where every single statement, every piece of evidence is 100% verifiable fact. But the way they're put together is just broken. There's a missing link, a huge logical leap, and that makes the whole argument fail, even though it's built out of true pieces. And this brings us to a super important word, validity. An argument is valid if its structure, its blueprint, is perfect. What that means is, if the starting reasons, the premises, were true, then the conclusion would have to be true. See that big is? That's everything. Validity is purely a check of the logical structure. It doesn't actually care if the premises are true in the real world. So here's the simple little stress test you can run on any argument's logic. Step 1, just lay out all the reasons it gives. Step 2, just for a second, pretend they are all completely 100% true. And then you ask the magic question. In this imaginary world where all the reasons are true, Is there any possible way the conclusion could still be false? If the answer is yes, then boom, the logic is invalid. Okay, look at this. This argument, it passes the validity test with flying colors. The logic is absolutely perfect. If those first two sentences were true, the conclusion would be undeniable. But here's the kicker. The first premise is just plain false, and so is the conclusion. John Quincy Adams was actually the 6th president. So what you're looking at is a perfect example of a logically valid argument that is completely and totally wrong.
All right, so if a valid argument can still be flat out wrong, then what are we even aiming for? What's the goal when we're trying to reason well? Well, let's take a look at the gold standard for any good argument.
And this little table lays it out perfectly. A valid argument, it clears the bar for logic. It has that perfect structure. But its foundation, the premises, they can be shaky. They can be totally false. A sound argument, on the other hand, has both. It's got the perfect logical structure, and its foundation is built on nothing but solid, true facts. This right here, this is what we're after. A sound argument is the whole package. It's logically watertight, and it's factually correct. And because of that amazing combination, its conclusion isn't just probably true, it is guaranteed to be true. That's the bullseye. So now that we have our core tools, we know how to test for validity and for soundness, let's go hunting. Let's take this new toolkit of ours and use it to spot some of the most common, most sneaky mistakes in reasoning that I promise you will see every single day. So a fallacy is, it's basically a faulty argument that's dressed up to look convincing. It's a reasoning trap. Some of them are broken because their logical form is just plain invalid, but others are more like sneaky psychological tricks that take advantage of our mental shortcuts. Oh man, you see this one everywhere. Especially online, right? Ad hominem. It's Latin for to the person, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's the mistake of completely ignoring the actual argument and just attacking the person who's making it. It's a total distraction, a shift from the idea to the individual. This is just a textbook ad hominem. A person's background, their job, their character, it has absolutely nothing to do with whether their argument is logically valid or based on true premises. Good ideas and bad ideas can come from anyone. You have to look at the argument, not the arguer, period. The straw man has got to be one of the most frustrating, most intellectually dishonest fallacies out there. See, instead of engaging with your opponent's actual strong argument, you build this weak, flimsy, distorted version of it, a straw man, and then you heroically knock that down instead. It gives you the illusion of winning a debate without ever touching the real issue. You see what politician B just did there? They took a pretty specific suggestion about a budget and twisted it into this completely absurd, extreme position. They're not arguing against the actual point anymore. They're arguing against leaving the country defenseless, something politician A never, ever said. Classic straw man. Now this is the fallacy of jumping to conclusions. It's what happens when we take maybe one or two examples, something we saw on the news, something that happened to a friend, and we blow it up into this huge sweeping rule that we think applies to everybody or everything. And this example right here shows just how incredibly dangerous and damaging this kind of fallacy can be. Good reasoning, it demands that we look at a lot of evidence, at a representative sample, before we start making giant claims. Using a few awful examples to smear an entire group of people is a huge, huge error in thinking. Okay, so let's pull all this together. Here are the 4 key tools we've put in our reasoning toolkit today. Number 1, separate the person from the argument, always. Number 2, fact-check the foundations. Are the premises actually true? Number 3, test the blueprint. Is the logic valid? And number 4, watch out for strawmen. Make sure you're arguing against the real thing. With these tools, you're now equipped to be an argument detective. You can look past the surface of things you see every single day, analyze the structure, check the foundation, and spot all the hidden traps. From news headlines to arguments on social media, just think about it. What are you going to see differently now that you know what to look for? Hey, and welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a philosophical idea that is, well, it's pretty out there. It's a theory that takes some of our most basic assumptions about what it means to be a good person and throws them right out the window. We are going to investigate ethical egoism. So let me just start by asking you this. Just think about it for a second. What if everything you've ever been taught about helping others, about sacrifice, about compassion, what if all of that was just wrong? What if, when it comes right down to it, the only person you ever had a moral duty to was yourself?
And that, right there, is the core of ethical egoism. It's this idea that our number one moral rule, our only moral rule, is to look out for number one. It kind of tosses out all those common ideas we hear about generosity and self-sacrifice. Now, according to an ethical egoist, you can help other people, sure, but only if doing so is ultimately going to benefit you. Okay, so here's our game plan. We're going to dig into this pretty radical idea, and we'll start by looking at two of the biggest arguments people make for it. Then we're going to put those arguments on the stand, see how they hold up, and uncover a really surprising contradiction.
You know, as we've seen, ethical egoism just completely flips our normal understanding of morality upside down. It's suggesting that things we usually think of as vices, like being selfish, are actually the very foundation of being a moral person. That is a huge claim, so let's start looking at the evidence. All right, let's bring in our first piece of evidence. Our source material calls this one the self-reliance argument. And you can see why. It's probably one of the most common sense arguments you'll hear for an egoist point of view. The logic here seems pretty simple, right? It goes like this. Premise 1. If we all just focused on taking care of ourselves, society as a whole would run a lot more smoothly. I mean, you know what you need better than anyone else, right? Premise 2. We should always do whatever makes everyone better off. So the conclusion seems to follow, we should all just mind our own business. Sounds pretty plausible, but let's just hang on to that thought for a minute. Okay, next up is Exhibit B, the libertarian argument. This angle tries to get to egoism by focusing on ideas of personal freedom and what we really owe to other people, if anything. So the thinking here goes like this. Any duty you have to help another person has to come from one of two places. Either you chose it, you consented, like making a promise, or you have to fix a harm you caused. So if neither of those things are true, the argument concludes that you have absolutely zero moral duty to help them. Your life, your time, your money, it's all yours. Okay, we've heard the opening statements, the case for ethical egoism. Now it's time to see if these arguments can really hold their own. We're going to put them under the microscope. The cross-examination is about to begin. So let's go back to that first argument, the self-reliance one. Remember that first premise? That everyone is better off if we all just mind our own business. But is that really actually true? Our source gives us this incredibly powerful scenario to think about. I mean, the answer is just obvious, isn't it? Of course you're not better off. You're desperately worse off if that person just walks by. That whole first premise seems to just fall apart in a real-world crisis. But you know, there's an even bigger issue with the self-reliance argument. It's in that second premise. We ought to do what makes everyone better off. You see the problem here? There's a total clash of goals. The argument is using a group goal, the good of everybody, to justify a philosophy that only cares about one thing, your own personal benefit. An egoist can't actually agree with that premise. And this is the real kicker, right from the source material. For an egoist, the one and only moral duty is to maximize your own benefit. The greater good is totally irrelevant unless it just so happens to also help you. So the self-reliance argument is trying to build its case on a principle that egoism itself flat out rejects. It's a fatal flaw in the logic. So what about that second argument, the libertarian one? Well, this is where things get really fascinating. It turns out that this piece of evidence doesn't just fail to support egoism, it actually ends up contradicting it. The evidence literally turns against itself. Just imagine this scenario. You make a promise, but keeping it turns out to be a huge pain, really costly for you. What do? Well, libertarianism, which is based on consent, says you have to keep it. You gave your word. But what does egoism say? It says your only duty is to your self-interest. So if keeping the promise hurts you more than it helps, you actually have a moral duty to break it. They're telling you to do the exact opposite things. So after all that, what's the final verdict from our investigation? Well, the self-reliance argument just doesn't work. Its main premise is often false, and its goal is one an egoist can't even accept. And the libertarian argument? It fails too, because it ends up giving advice that directly clashes with egoism. That case that seemed so simple and provocative, turns out it's built on some really shaky ground. And that leaves us right here with this one final massive question. If ethical egoism doesn't hold up, if our only duty isn't just to ourselves, then where do our obligations to other people actually come from? Why should we help that person having a heart attack? It's a question that forces us to look way beyond the easy answers and right into the heart of what morality is all about. Definitely something to think about.
All right, let's dive in. It's a question we've all probably asked ourselves at some point. Am I doing this right? Is my life good? How could it be better? Well, today we're going to go on a philosopher's quest to figure out if there's a standard, a guide, for what really makes a life go well.
So let's get right to it. The big question right up front. What really makes your life go well? I don't mean just fine or okay, but genuinely, truly well. And this isn't just some late-night thought, right? It's the whole reason we're here today. We're going to explore a couple of the most powerful answers that philosophy has come up with. Okay, so our search kicks off with a really important distinction. You can think of it as the first major clue on our map.
And it's this: the difference between instrumental goods and intrinsic goods. Just think about money for a second. Is money good? Well, yeah, but it's an instrumental good. It's valuable for what it gets you, right? Food, a home, a vacation. But what we're really after are the intrinsic goods, the things that are valuable just for what they are, for their own sake. They're the final destination, not just a layover on the way to somewhere else.
So what's the end of the line? What is that ultimate intrinsic good? Well, the most popular answer, the one that's been around forever and probably the first one that just popped into your head, is happiness. And that brings us to our first major theory: hedonism.
Basically, hedonism is this idea that a good life is simply a life that's packed with pleasure and as free from pain as possible. That's it. That's the whole deal. In this view, happiness is the one and the only thing that's intrinsically good. Everything else, just a tool to get you more of it. And you can totally see why this is so appealing, right? For one, it's flexible. It says there are tons of different ways to live a good life. Because what makes me happy might be totally different from what makes you happy. It puts us in charge. And let's be honest, the idea that happiness is good for us just feels, well, obvious.
But hold on a second. Is it really that simple? Is a life of nothing but pure, unfiltered pleasure actually the best kind of life a person can have? Let's throw a little wrench in the works with a super famous thought experiment.
So, the philosopher Robert Nozick came up with this brilliant idea. Picture this. There's an experience machine. You can plug into this thing for the rest of your life, and it will give you any experience you could possibly want. You'll think it's 100% real, and you will feel happier than you ever thought possible. So here's the big question for you. Would you plug in? Knowing that it's all a simulation, would you trade in your real, messy life for a guaranteed perfect but totally fake one? You know what? When people really stop and think about it, most of them say, no way. And that simple no creates a massive problem for hedonism.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because it shows us why we'd say no. I mean, if happiness was the only thing that mattered, we'd all be lining up to plug in. But clearly, we value other things. We want our accomplishments to be real, not just some illusion. We want our happiness to come from our own authentic choices, not just programmed into our brains. We want a life that's actually rooted in reality.
See, what this whole thing reveals is just how much we value autonomy, the power to actually be the one guiding our own life. We want our lives to be authentic, to be ours, even if making our own choices means we stumble, and even if it sometimes costs us a little bit of happiness. And that's something pure hedonism has a really hard time explaining.
Okay, so if a life of pure pleasure isn't the whole story, where does our quest take us next? Well, it leads us to another really powerful idea. Maybe the good life isn't about feeling a certain way, but about getting what you want.
This brings us to something called the desire satisfaction theory. And the idea here is super simple, but also really powerful. Your life goes well for you when you get what you want. Simple as that. Your desires, whatever they happen to be, are what define what's good for you. This theory basically hands you the keys and says, you decide.
And you can see why this is so convincing, right? The logic is really tight. It basically says if something is truly intrinsically good for you, then it's got to be something you want. And if you want it, you'll be motivated to go get it. So what's good for you and what you're motivated to pursue are perfectly linked.
Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Total freedom, you're the ultimate authority on your own life. But you guessed it, just like hedonism, this path has its own set of traps. It turns out that just getting what we want, well, it isn't always good for us. So think about this. The musician who spends their entire life dreaming of fame. They practice for decades, they tour, they finally make it big. They get exactly what they wanted, only to find out it feels totally empty, and they're more miserable than ever. Their deepest desire was satisfied, but it's pretty hard to say their life actually got better.
Or how about desires that are just based on bad info? Let's say you want to get revenge on a coworker because you heard they sabotaged your project. But what if they didn't? What if it was all a misunderstanding? Getting what you want, getting that revenge, wouldn't actually make your life any better. In fact, it'd probably make it worse.
And this next one, this one is probably the toughest challenge for the theory. Imagine someone who's been raised in total oppression, and they've been taught their entire life that their only goal, their only desire should be to serve their master. Now, they might get that desire satisfied every single day of their life, but can we really stand back and say, yep, that's a good life? It really forces us to wonder if all desires are created equal.
So, where does all this leave us? We've visited the land of pure pleasure, and we've walked the path of pure desire, and neither one gave us a perfect map to the good life. But just getting a handle on why they're so appealing and where they fall short, that's a huge step forward on our journey. So let's just put these two side by side for a second. Hedonism says value comes from pleasure. Its great strength is that it's intuitive and flexible, but its fatal flaw, it completely devalues reality and our own autonomy. Then you have the desire satisfaction theory. It says value comes from getting what you want, which is great because it champions our personal freedom. But its fatal flaw is that it has no way to judge the quality of our desires.
And all of this leaves us wrestling with a final, really important question. If a good life isn't just about feeling good, and it's not just about getting what you want, then maybe there are some objective standards for a good life. Things that are good for us whether we happen to want them or not. Things like knowledge, or real friendships, or freedom. But what are those things, and how can we know for sure? Well, that's where your quest continues.
You ever get that feeling that some things are just, well, naturally right or wrong? That maybe, just maybe, our moral compass isn't something we just invent, but something we find in the world around us and, inside ourselves? Today, we're diving deep into an idea that has fascinated thinkers for centuries: natural law theory. Our source text really gets to the heart of this. The core idea, it's actually super intuitive. Think about a racehorse. What makes a good racehorse? Well, being fast, strong, built for speed, it's just fulfilling its nature. Or a chameleon. A good chameleon is one that can blend right into its background. In both cases, nature seems to set the standard. So the theory asks a really simple question. Can we say the same thing about us humans? And yeah, that right there, that's the million-dollar question. It's one thing for a racehorse, but for us, it is a whole lot more complicated. This single question is really what we're going to be wrestling with today. But before we start poking holes in it, we really need to understand why this idea has been so powerful for so long. What is it that natural law theory actually promises?
The theory itself puts it out there pretty plainly, and it's a bold claim. Morality is fundamentally tied to nature. If you act in line with your true human nature, you're doing good. If you act against it, you're doing wrong. It's simple, it's elegant, and you can see why it's so appealing.
So when you look at it like this, you can see how the theory seems to solve some of the biggest, most nagging problems in all of ethics. It promises an objective morality, not just your opinion versus my opinion. It explains why we hold people morally responsible, but, not our dogs. It even gives morality a clear origin story. And maybe the biggest promise of all, it offers a path to figuring out what's right. Just understand what it means to be human.
But as you've probably guessed, that last part, figuring out our own nature, that's exactly where this beautiful-sounding theory starts to run into some pretty serious trouble. This is the central puzzle we have to solve.
So, here's the crucial point. Literally, everything rests on how we define this. If we can't agree on what our nature even is, the whole theory just kind of collapses. So let's look at a few ways people have tried to define it. Okay, idea number one is simple. Maybe our nature is just our animal nature. And sure, this explains some basic drives, but if we actually look to the animal kingdom for a complete moral guide, well, we are in for a serious shock. It can be a brutal, violent place, and that is definitely not a foundation you can build a stable morality on.
All right, what about our innate nature? The traits we're born with before society messes everything up. Well, the philosopher Rousseau, he thought we were born good, cooperative, kind, the whole deal. But then you've got Hobbes, who argued the complete opposite, that we're naturally selfish and competitive. I mean, if Hobbes is right, then following our nature would mean being awful to each other. We can't build a moral theory on a total coin flip.
And that clash between Hobbes and Rousseau really gets to the heart of the problem. Morality isn't about where an impulse comes from. As the source text argues, a horrible act is horrible, whether the urge was innate or something you learned. And a good deed is good, whether you were born a saint or not. The origin just doesn't determine the morality of the action.
So a third try is to say our nature is whatever is universal to all humans. But this idea fails too. For one, it's actually really hard to find a single complex trait that every single human shares. And second, even if most of us were, let's say, selfish, would that automatically make selfishness morally good? No way. Ultimately, confusing what is statistically typical with what is morally right is a really, really dangerous mistake to make.
Okay, so if human nature isn't about being like animals or what we're born with or what we all have in common, what's left? Well, the next move is to define our nature not by our traits, but by our purpose. What are we for?
The source lays out two main secular models here. You've got the efficiency model, which says our purpose is whatever we're best at. But you could argue humans are more efficient at designing weapons than building hospitals, and that would lead to some morally absurd conclusions. So most people pivot to the fitness model. Our purpose is simply to survive and reproduce. But this fitness model leads to a really dark place. You might recognize this logic as the foundation for things like social Darwinism. A reflection in the source, inspired by Holocaust survivor Primo Levi, shows the horrifying flaw here. If survival is the ultimate good, then the most ruthless, the most treacherous people are actually the most natural. It would make selfishness a virtue and condemn acts of self-sacrifice as immoral. I mean, that's a world without heroes.
So, as a complete theory, natural law seems to be in some deep trouble. But that whole focus on our purpose and our intentions, it wasn't a total dead end. It actually led to a really important philosophical tool for thinking about tough moral choices, the doctrine of double effect.
The absolutely crucial distinction this idea makes is between intending to cause harm as part of your plan versus merely foreseeing that harm will happen as a side effect of an otherwise good action.
And to see how this works, let's use the famous, or maybe infamous, trolley problem. Imagine a runaway trolley is about to hit 5 people tied to the tracks. In one case, you can pull a lever to divert it onto a side track, where unfortunately there's one person tied up. In the second case, you're on a bridge with a very large person. The only way to stop the trolley is to push that person onto the tracks below. So, what do you do?
The doctrine of double effect offers a way to think about this. When you push the person, their death is the means to your end. You are literally intending the harm to save the others. But when you pull the lever, that one person's death is a tragic, foreseen side effect. It's not your direct goal. Your goal is just to save the 5 people. For people who support this doctrine, that distinction makes all the moral difference in the world.
The problem, of course, is that in the real world, this line between intending something and just foreseeing it can be incredibly blurry. Philosophers have been arguing for centuries about how to draw it cleanly. So while the idea is really powerful, applying it with any confidence is a huge challenge.
So where does that leave us? The big promise of natural law was that it would ground morality in the solid facts of nature. But as we've seen, you can't just look at what is natural and automatically know what ought to be moral. Nature gives us our abilities, it gives us our limits, it sets the stage. But it seems we're the ones who have to write the moral script.
And that's the final question I really want to leave you with. The theory offers this beautifully simple vision of morality rooted in our very being. But if that foundation, our nature, is itself a puzzle that has no clear answer, can we ever truly rely on it to guide us through our most difficult choices?
Today, we are diving into a huge idea in moral philosophy, something called consequentialism, and it's built on a single, really provocative claim. When you're trying to figure out if an act is right or wrong, the only thing that matters is the result. So, let's explore what that really means.
I mean, what if every moral problem you've ever faced could be solved with a calculator? Not by looking into your heart, not by following a set of ancient rules, but by just doing a cold, hard cost-benefit analysis. That's the core idea and maybe the biggest challenge of the ethical system we're looking at today.
So, what is consequentialism? Well, it's not actually a single theory. It's more like a whole family of them. But they all share this one core belief.
Consequences are everything. Your intentions don't matter. The action itself doesn't matter. The only thing that counts in the end is the outcome. That's what decides if what you did was right or wrong. Okay, so how would you actually use this? Well, in theory, it's a 5-step process. First, you figure out what's just good in and of itself, things like happiness or well-being. Then you identify what's intrinsically bad, like pain and suffering. Step 3, you lay out all of your possible options. 4, you calculate the good versus the bad for each of those options. And finally, you just pick the one that gives you the best possible balance. That choice, the one with the best net outcome, is what philosophers call the optimific choice. And according to this theory, that's your moral duty.
Now, the most famous version of this, the one you've probably heard of, is called act utilitarianism. And for utilitarians, there's really only one thing that's intrinsically good, and that's well-being, or, happiness. So the goal becomes crystal clear. Whatever you're doing, your moral obligation is to do the one thing that creates the most overall well-being for everyone involved.
So you might be asking, what's the big deal? Why has this idea been so incredibly influential for centuries? Well, let's get into the promise of utilitarianism, because you'll see its appeal is really, really powerful. At the absolute heart of it is the principle of utility. Think of it as the ultimate moral rule. There's no long list of do's and don'ts. There's just one guiding principle. Do the most good that you can possibly do. And if you failed to do that, even if you meant well, you've technically acted wrongly. And you can see why this is so attractive, right? For one thing, it's totally impartial. The happiness of a complete stranger counts just as much as your own. It also lines up with a lot of our moral common sense. I mean, of course, slavery is wrong, and helping people in need is right. Plus, it gives you a clear tool to solve tough moral puzzles, and it's flexible. It recognizes that no rule is absolute, that context really matters.
This way of thinking also led to one of its most radical and, frankly, forward-thinking features. One of the pioneers of utilitarianism, the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, made this incredible argument. He said our moral community isn't just limited to humans. Because animals can suffer, their well-being has to be included in our moral math. It was a revolutionary idea back then, and it's still a cornerstone of the animal rights movement today.
Okay, so it all sounds pretty good on paper. But, and this is a huge but, when you start to apply this theory in the real world, you run into some massive problems. It leads to some really tough, and I mean tough, questions.
So, the first major problem people point to is what's called the demandingness objection. Think about it. If your moral duty is always to do the action that creates the most possible good, how could you ever justify just relaxing or spending money on yourself? It seems to demand that we all live like saints, constantly sacrificing every moment and every dollar for the greater good.
Let's make this really concrete. Look at this choice. For a true utilitarian, this isn't much of a choice at all. The immense good you could do by donating that money, providing warmth for 250 kids, so vastly outweighs the little bit of happiness you'd get from a vacation that taking the vacation is, according to the theory, morally wrong. There's no room for good enough. You have to do the best thing.
Next up, we have the impartiality problem. And remember how he said impartiality was one of its great strengths? Well, here's where it becomes a huge weakness. The theory says you shouldn't prioritize helping your own child over helping, say, 2 strangers you've never met, if that would create more overall happiness. And that just clashes deeply with our gut feeling that we have special duties to the people we love.
And this might be the killer objection for many people. If the only thing that matters is the final outcome, what happens when a terrible, unjust act leads to the best result? So, imagine a scenario where framing and punishing one innocent person could stop a massive riot that would kill hundreds. Utilitarianism seems to say that not only would punishing that innocent person be okay, it would be your moral duty to do it. So let's recap. The theory seems way too demanding, it ignores our most important relationships, and it might even tell us to commit horrible injustices. That's a huge problem. But philosophers didn't just give up. They tried to find a fix. And the fix was to change the focus. So instead of judging every single act on its own, what if we started judging rules? This new idea, rule consequentialism, asks a different question. What if everyone followed a certain rule? Would that society have the best overall outcome? An action, then, is only right if it follows one of these best outcomes social rules.
And this new approach seems to solve our problems almost perfectly. I mean, a rule that says it's okay to punish the innocent would create a terrifying society full of mistrust. That's a horrible outcome, so that rule is out. But a rule like, it's good to give special care to your own family, generally leads to a happier, more stable society, so that rule is in.
It kind of brings the theory back in line with our basic moral intuitions.
So, problem solved, right? It seems like a perfect fix. Well, not so fast. This clever solution ends up creating its own deep and maybe even fatal dilemma for any consequentialist.
Here's the fatal contradiction. What happens when you're in a specific situation where you absolutely know that breaking an otherwise good rule will lead to a better result in this one instance? Well, rule consequentialism says you have to follow the rule anyway, which means it's forcing you to go against the entire spirit of the theory, which is all about producing the best consequences. It basically abandons its own core principle.
Let's take this out of the abstract and look at a famous and tragic real-world example. Back in the 1970s, Ford had a new car, the Pinto, and they knew it had a serious design flaw that made the gas tank likely to explode in a rear-end collision.
So Ford did a cost-benefit analysis that is just chilling. They calculated the cost to fix the fuel tank on every car versus what they called the benefit of not fixing it, which was just the money they'd have to pay out for an estimated number of deaths and injuries. They actually put a price tag on a human life, just over $200,000, and decided it was cheaper to let people die than to install an $11 part.
And this leaves us with a final haunting question. Using that pure consequentialist logic, was Ford's decision wrong? Is it because their math was bad? Did they fail to calculate the long-term cost of lawsuits and the damage to their reputation? Or is the very act of putting a price tag on a human life and plugging it into an equation an injustice so profound that it's wrong no matter what the outcome is? That's the dilemma at the very heart of consequentialism.
You know that little voice in your head that sometimes says, "Go on, it's just this one time. It won't hurt anyone"? Well, today we're going to dive into the world of Immanuel Kant. He came up with this really powerful way of looking at right and wrong that honestly flips the script. It's got nothing to do with the outcome and everything to do with fairness and respect. All right, so to really wrap our heads around what Kant's getting at, let's start with a scenario that probably feels, well, pretty familiar to all of us. It really boils down to that temptation we all feel sometimes to make ourselves a special exception to the rules.
So picture this person. They're thinking, you know what, if I just keep a little bit of this tax money for a family vacation, it'll create so much happiness. And the government, they're huge. They won't even notice it's missing. And you see the same kind of logic everywhere, right? The person who zooms down the emergency lane to beat a traffic jam, or the student who cheats on just one exam to pass a tough class.
And that brings us to the central question here. If they get what they want, and it seems like nobody really gets hurt, then what exactly is the problem? I mean, where's the harm? The way Kant answers this is what makes his whole philosophy so different.
See, for Kant, the problem isn't about the consequences at all. It's about the sheer unfairness of it. He'd say that the tax cheat, the person cutting in line, the exam cheater, they're all counting on one thing, that everyone else is going to follow the rules. Their success, their little shortcut, only works because they're breaking a system they expect everyone else to maintain. And that, right there, is a massive contradiction. It's just fundamentally unfair.
Okay, so how are we supposed to spot this kind of unfairness in our own lives, in our own decisions? Well, this is where Kant gets really clever. He came up with this brilliant, almost mathematical test to figure it out.
So first, we've got to get this term he uses, a maxim. It sounds complicated, but it's not. It's just the rule or the principle you're following when you decide to do something. So for our tax cheat, the maxim is basically, when I want some extra cash for myself, I'll just not pay my taxes. Simple. We all have these personal rules we act on, even if we never actually say them out loud.
All right, here's the test itself. Kant called it the principle of universalizability. Quite a mouthful, I know. But it's basically 3 steps. Step 1, figure out your maxim, state it clearly. Step 2, imagine a world where everybody follows that maxim, like it's a universal law. And then, step 3, ask yourself the million-dollar question. In that new world, could you still actually achieve your original goal?
And here's the kicker. If the answer is no, if your goal totally falls apart in that world, then your maxim has failed the test. It's built on a contradiction. And for Kant, if something's irrational, it's immoral. Simple as that. But hey, if the answer's yes, if it all still works out, then your action is morally okay.
Let's go back to the tax cheat. This just illustrates it perfectly. If everyone's maximum was, I'll cheat on my taxes to go on vacation, what would happen? Well, the government would collapse. There'd be no money for roads, for schools, for anything. The whole system that the cheat is trying to exploit would completely disappear. Their goal to get away with it becomes impossible. It literally self-destructs when everyone does it.
Okay, that seems like a pretty solid logical test for fairness, right? But let's push it a little. Let's see if it holds up when we throw a real curveball at it. And this is where it gets tricky. The test works like a charm for things like lying or cheating, because those actions depend on a world where most people are telling the truth and playing fair. But it starts to break down when you look at more extreme, more disturbing examples.
Just think about a true fanatic. Someone whose personal rule, their maxim, is to persecute a specific group of people they hate. And this person is so committed, so fanatical, that they would honestly be willing to be persecuted themselves if the tables were turned. Now, let's run that through the test. Can you imagine a world where everyone follows that maxim? Yes, you can. It would be a truly horrific world, but the fanatic's goal, to persecute people, could absolutely be achieved. Their awful maxim passes the test.
And that is a massive problem. If your moral test can't rule out the actions of a consistent, dedicated fanatic, then that test can't be the whole story. There's got to be something essential missing from the equation.
So this flaw, this big hole in the first test, brings us to Kant's second big idea. And this one is arguably even more influential. In fact, you could say this next idea became a cornerstone for our entire modern concept of human rights. This is what he called the principle of humanity. And honestly, it's a total game changer. What it says is that the foundation of morality isn't about logical consistency, it's about dignity. It's the idea that every rational person has this inherent priceless value. You can't just use people like they're tools to get what you want. You have to respect them as ends in themselves, as individuals with their own goals, their own dreams, their own lives.
Okay, now let's break this down, because it's a really important distinction. Kant separates treating someone as a means from treating them as a mere means. So think about it. When you hire a plumber to fix a leaky pipe, are you using them? Well, yeah, you're using them as a means to get your pipe fixed. But, and this is the crucial part, that's totally okay, because you're also treating them as an end. You're respecting their autonomy. They agree to the job, you agree on a price, you pay them for their time and skill. It's a consensual exchange. But if you were to lie to them or force them to fix your pipe for free, now you're treating them as a mere means, just a tool. And that's when you've crossed a serious moral line.
And this is why this second principle is so powerful. It succeeds exactly where the first one failed. The fanatic, they're wrong because they treat their victims as mere things, as obstacles in the way of their goal, completely stripping them of their humanity. Slavery is profoundly immoral because it denies a person's autonomy and treats them as property. Even something like paternalism, treating adults like children for their own good, is wrong because it disrespects their capacity to choose for themselves. You can literally see how this one idea, respect for persons, forms the bedrock of our modern ideas about human rights.
All right, so let's zoom out and pull all this together. What is Kant's huge enduring contribution to the way we think about ethics? Well, before Kant came along, a lot of ethical thinking was all about the consequences. It was consequentialist. You judge an action by its results. Did it create more happiness or more pain? Kant just completely turned that on its head. He said, nope, forget the results. The morality of an action is found in the intention, in the rule, the maxim that you were following. It's not about what happens in the end. It's about why you did it in the first place. So from a Kantian point of view, the goal of life isn't to just make the world a happier place. It's about something deeper. It's about acting with integrity. It's about doing your duty, being fair, and above all, respecting that priceless, profound value that exists inside every single rational person. Now, of course, no theory is perfect, and Kant's has its own tough questions. I mean, applying the principle of humanity can get pretty vague in complicated real-world situations. And here's a big one. If our moral value comes from our ability to reason and be autonomous, what does that mean for beings who don't have those abilities? What about infants, or animals, or people with severe cognitive disabilities?
And that's the really tough question that Kant's philosophy leaves us wrestling with. If our ultimate value really comes from our ability to reason, what moral duties do we truly owe to those who can't? It forces us to think hard about who belongs inside our moral community and why. And that is a huge challenge that's still right at the heart of so many ethical debates today.
There's this kind of invisible deal that you've made just by being alive in a society.
It's a contract you never actually signed, but believe me, it shapes almost everything you do, every single day. So today, we're going to break down this huge foundational agreement we all share. We're talking about the social contract.
All right, so to really get our heads around this giant societal deal, we're going to start small, like really small. Just two people facing a really tough choice. And it's a kind of puzzle, one that reveals a pretty surprising and honestly sometimes troubling truth about us, about human nature, and our ability to cooperate.
Okay, so I want you to really imagine this. You're caught. Your partner, your accomplice, is in the interrogation room right next door. The cops come in and they offer you a deal. But here's the thing. They're offering your partner the exact same deal. Your freedom, it doesn't just depend on what you do. It depends on what they do. So, what's your move? Okay, so this is the classic prisoner's dilemma. Let's make it simple. We'll call our two prisoners Al and Bob. Now look at the options here. The best possible outcome for them together, for the team, is if they both just keep their mouths shut, right? That's only 2 years in jail each. But man, that temptation to betray, it's huge. Because if Al confesses and Bob stays quiet, Al walks away completely free. Of course, the absolute worst-case scenario is they both betray each other. Then they're both stuck with 4 years.
All right, let's get inside Al's head for a second. He has no idea what Bob is doing in the other room, so he runs the scenarios. He's thinking, okay, let's say Bob stays silent. What's my best move? Well, obviously, I should confess. 0 years is a whole lot better than 2. But then he thinks, okay, but what if Bob confesses? Well, my best move is still to confess, because 4 years is way better than getting stuck with 6. See where this is going? And here it is. This is the absolute core of it. Both Al and Bob, just by thinking perfectly rationally and looking out for number one, are going to choose to confess. It's the logical move for each of them. But the result? They both get a worse outcome. They both end up worse off than if they had just trusted each other. Isn't that wild? Rational individual choices lead to a terrible result for the group. That's the paradox.
So, that little puzzle with 2 people in a jail cell? Well, what if I told you that the exact same logic is at play when you scale it up to millions or even billions of people? What happens when an entire society gets caught in one giant prisoner's dilemma? Well, believe it or not, the philosopher Thomas Hobbes was wrestling with this exact problem centuries ago. He came up with this amazing thought experiment. He asked, what would life actually be like if there were no rules, no government, no laws, no police to enforce anything? Just total freedom.
And let me tell you, his conclusion was not pretty. It was terrifying, actually. He famously said that life in this world without rules would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Just imagine that. A constant, never-ending battle for survival, where everyone is just driven by fear and pure self-interest. It's about as bleak as it gets.
Hobbes gave this idea a name. He called it the state of nature. And you know what it is? It's the prisoner's dilemma, just on a massive societal scale. Think about it. If it's rational for me to steal my neighbor's food just to survive, well, it's also rational for them to steal mine. Suddenly, we're all locked in this constant war of all against all. You can't trust anyone, ever.
So, if we're all trapped in this terrible game, this logical trap that just makes everyone worse off, how do we get out, right? How do you escape the state of nature? Well, it turns out humanity came up with a pretty genius escape plan. We make a deal. That's the solution. We invent something called the social contract. Now, it's not a piece of paper you sign. It's more of an unspoken agreement. We all kind of agree to give up some of our absolute freedoms, like, the freedom to just take whatever we want. And in exchange, we get something way better, the peace and security that comes from everyone working together.
And really, this trade-off is the heart of the whole thing. Look at it this way. We give up the freedom to just go around harming people, but we get security in return. We're not constantly looking over our shoulder. We give up the freedom to steal, and in return, we get to have our own property protected. We basically agree to dial back our unlimited self-interest, and what we get is a stable, predictable society where we can actually build things and, live. I'd say that's a pretty good trade.
All right, so we agree to make some rules. Great. That sounds like the easy part, right? But here's the really tricky question. How do we make sure the rules we come up with are actually fair for everybody? And this is a massive problem. I mean, let's be real. If the people writing the rules are super rich, what kind of rules do you think they're going to write? Ones that benefit the rich? Probably. If they're already powerful, they'll make rules to keep their power.
It's just human nature. So how in the world do you get around that kind of built-in bias?
Well, a much more recent philosopher, a guy named John Rawls, came up with a really clever solution to this. It's kind of like a mind hack. See, he didn't just want us to try to be less biased. He designed a thought experiment where being biased is literally impossible. He called it the veil of ignorance. Here's the idea. Imagine you get to design the rules for a brand new society from scratch. But, and this is the big but, you are behind a veil of ignorance. You have absolutely no idea who you're going to be in that society. You don't know if you'll be rich or poor. You don't know your race, your gender, your religion, your talents, your health, nothing. You are completely in the dark.
And this is where the genius of it kicks in. Because you don't know if you're going to end up at the very top or the very bottom of this new society, what's the most rational, self-interested thing to do? Well, you're going to create the fairest possible rules you can think of. You'd want strong protections for the poor, right? Just in case you end up being poor. You'd want equal rights for every group, just in case you end up in a minority group. All of a sudden, being fair isn't just a nice idea, it becomes the most logical, rational choice for your own survival.
Okay. So this isn't just some dusty old philosophy. This isn't just a thought experiment. The logic of the prisoner's dilemma and the strength of our social contract is being put to the test every single day, right now, all over the world.
Just think about some of the big issues we face. Doping in sports? That's a classic prisoner's dilemma. If I think everyone else is doping, my most rational move is to dope too, just to compete. And the result? The whole sport is dirty and the risks are higher for everyone. It's the exact same logic with something massive like climate change, or even with countries deciding on international aid. Nobody wants to be the sucker, the only one making a sacrifice. And that fear often pushes everyone to make the selfish choice, and in the end, we all end up worse off.
And this quote from Caspar Hare at MIT just hits the nail on the head. He says, "It may be that some of us are individually better off short-term driving SUVs, but if we all emit carbon like crazy, we're all worse off." That's it, right there. That gap between what's good for me right now and what's good for all of us in the long run, that's where the social contract really gets pushed to its limits. Billions of choices that make perfect sense for each individual can add up to one giant collective disaster.
So that kind of leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? When you look at our biggest global challenges, climate change, pandemics, international conflicts, is it possible that our biggest problem is that we're all just trapped in a massive, planet-sized prisoner's dilemma? And if that's true, is there a way to rewrite the rules? Can we find a way to trust each other and cooperate before we all make the logical choice and betray one another? Have you ever been in a situation where you're stuck between a rock and a hard place? You know, morally speaking, where doing the right thing also feels kind of wrong? Yeah, life is messy, and those simple, unbreakable rules we're sometimes taught, they often just don't work. So today, we're going to dive into a really fascinating ethical framework. Think of it as a moral toolkit, one designed for making those tough calls in the real world. Okay, let's just jump right in with a classic dilemma. So, you've promised to meet a friend. Keeping promises, that's a good thing, right? But on your way, you see an accident. Someone's hurt, and helping them, that's also a good thing. The problem is, you can't do both. So what gives? And look, this isn't some trick question. This is exactly the kind of conflict that really rigid, black and white ethical systems just can't handle. That feeling of being pulled in two directions where both choices feel like a duty, that's what we can call the all or nothing trap. And it's a huge problem that pops up when we treat our moral rules as these absolute, unbreakable laws. It can tie us up in some serious logical knots. To really get what's going on, let's look at two big ideas. On one side, you've got ethical absolutism. This is the view that moral rules are totally ironclad. If the rule is never lie, you can never lie, period. But then you have ethical pluralism, which says, hey, wait a minute, there's more than just one big moral rule. We have all these different duties, to be kind, to be fair, to keep our promises, and a whole lot more. And this is where it all falls apart. If you believe there are multiple moral rules, and you believe they're all absolute, you're going to hit a wall. In that car accident scenario, if never break a promise and always help someone in need are both totally unbreakable, you're stuck in a logical contradiction. You're required to do two things that are physically impossible to do at the same time. The whole system just breaks. So, how do we get out of this mess? Well, this is where a philosopher named W.D. Ross comes in.
He looked at this exact problem and came up with a pretty brilliant solution. He said, you know what, we can accept that there are a bunch of different moral rules, but we have to let go of the idea that they're absolute. He gave us a much more flexible, common-sense way to look at things.
And the heart and soul of his idea is this concept, the prima facie duty. It's a Latin phrase that means at first view or on the face of it. Think of it as a genuine, serious moral reason to do something. It's not a suggestion, it's a real moral pull on you. But, and this is the most important part, it's a duty that is binding unless it gets overridden by a stronger, more important duty in that specific situation.
So what Ross basically gave us is a moral toolkit. Instead of one single, rigid rulebook that's supposed to cover everything, he gave us a set of these prima facie duties that we're constantly juggling. These are the tools, the fundamental considerations that we pull out and weigh against each other when we're trying to figure out what to do.
So, what's actually in this toolkit? Well, first, you have fidelity. That's keeping your promises, being true to your word. Then, reparations. Fixing the harm you've done. There's gratitude for returning kindness. Justice for making sure things are fair. Beneficence, which is just a fancy word for doing good for other people. Self-improvement, working on being a better person. And finally, non-maleficence, which is the duty to not cause harm. A lot of people see that one as the bedrock of the whole thing.
Now, what's really cool about this is how humble the theory is. Ross wasn't saying, this is it, the perfect final list. He thought it did a pretty good job of capturing the core moral gut feelings we all have, but he was totally open to the idea that maybe there are others, or that the list could be improved. The real focus is on the idea of these flexible duties, not just this one specific list.
Okay, so we've got our toolkit, we know what the tools are. Now for the fun part. Let's see how this system actually works when we're out in the real world, especially when those duties start pulling us in opposite directions.
Let's use this really powerful example. You have a single mom, her child is sick, too sick for school. Now she's promised her boss she'll be at work and she really needs this job, but her child is sick and needs her, and there's nobody else. What's the right thing to do? I mean, this is a truly heart-wrenching, real-world kind of conflict.
So let's break this down with Ross's toolkit. On the one hand, she has a prima facie duty of fidelity to her job. She gave her word, she made a commitment. But on the other hand, she has this incredibly powerful prima facie duty of non-maleficence, her duty to prevent harm from coming to her sick, vulnerable child.
And here is the absolute key to the whole thing. When she decides to stay home with her child, which, let's be honest, most of us would say is the right call, the duty to her job doesn't just poof, disappear into thin air. It's still there. It's a real moral obligation. It's just that in this specific case, it was outweighed by a much more urgent, much more important duty.
This is just such a brilliant insight. Seriously, think about this. Have you ever done the right thing, but still felt a little bit bad about it? That's what this quote gets at. The mom probably feels a pang of guilt or anxiety about calling out of work. Ross would say that feeling, that regret, is the emotional echo of the duty she had to override. It's our brain's way of acknowledging that we had to sacrifice something of real moral value to uphold an even greater one.
Now, this all feels really intuitive, right? It feels true to how we actually experience these dilemmas, but it leads us straight to the single biggest, toughest question for this entire way of thinking.
Right? I mean, if there's no fixed ranking, no rule that's always at the top of the list, then how on earth do we actually decide which duty wins when they clash? The mother's case seems pretty clear-cut, but what about situations that are way more balanced, way more complicated? What's the method?
And this is Ross's answer. And it can feel both totally liberating and, honestly, a little frustrating. He says, there is no formula. There's no fixed hierarchy where justice always beats gratitude or fidelity always beats beneficence. His whole point is that trying to create a rigid system like that is what got other theories into trouble in the first place.
So if there's no magic formula, what are we supposed to do? Well, Ross argues that making a good moral decision is a skill you develop, not a math problem you solve. First, you have to really look at the situation and understand all the morally important details. See which duties are in play. Then, you bring everything you have, your life experience, your wisdom, your empathy, to the table. And finally, you use your best judgment.
And if that sounds a little too fuzzy for you, think about it like this. When a jury listens to a case, there isn't some mathematical equation that tells them if someone is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. They use their judgment. When scientists are trying to decide between two competing theories, there's no simple checklist. They have to use their considered judgment. In all the most complicated and important areas of life, we rely on this skill, and Ross is just saying that our moral lives are no different. And that really leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. With this system, we're trading the comfort of having easy answers and simple rigid rules for something that seems to do a much better job of capturing the complexity, the conflict, and the real messiness of our actual moral lives. So, is a system that relies on judgment a flaw? Or is its refusal to give us a simple answer actually its greatest strength, because it's just telling us the truth about the world we all have to navigate every single day?
You know, when you think about morality, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For a lot of us, it's a list of rules, right? Don't lie, don't steal, the golden rule. But what if that's not the whole picture? What if being a good person isn't about memorizing a rule book, but about becoming a certain kind of person? Well, that's the powerful idea behind virtue ethics. Okay, so where do we even begin? Well, virtue ethics comes along and completely flips the script on how we usually think about morality. It starts by changing the most fundamental question we're supposed to be asking. For, centuries, moral philosophy has been obsessed with this one question. You've got all these theories that judge morality by its consequences or by a set of unbreakable rules, but they're all focused on one thing, our actions. It's all about the doing. And this is where things get interesting. Virtue ethics, with roots stretching way, way back to Aristotle in ancient Greece, basically says, hold on a second, maybe we've been asking the wrong question this whole time. It suggests we shouldn't start with what to do, but with who we ought to be. And that is the absolute game changer right there. The focus moves from the act itself to the agent, the person performing the act. It's a really profound shift that reframes the entire way we think about living a good and moral life. So, if morality isn't just about following a set of rules, how in the world are we supposed to know what's right? Well, virtue ethics proposes a different kind of moral compass, an ideal person, a role model. At its core, virtue ethics isn't really one single theory, it's more like a whole family of them, but they all rally around this one central idea. Our moral duty is defined by what a truly good person would do, and what it really means to live a flourishing human life. This completely redefines what a right action even is, doesn't it? It's not about some complicated calculation or following a universal law. Nope. On the surface, it's much simpler. The right thing to do is whatever a truly good, virtuous person would do in that exact situation. So, instead of reaching for a rule book, we're supposed to look to a moral exemplar. This ideal person is our role model. They provide a goal for us to aim for, something to strive toward, even if we know we're not always going to hit the bullseye perfectly. Okay, but hold on. If there's no rule book, how are we supposed to navigate the messy, complicated real world? Virtue ethicists have a really interesting answer for this. Morality isn't a formula. It's a skill you develop. Yeah, Aristotle himself pointed this out. He basically said, look, ethics isn't math. You can't just plug in some variables and get a nice, clean answer every single time. Life's just not like that. It's complex, and being a good person requires real wisdom, flexibility, and good judgment. And you can really see the difference in approach here, can't you? The rulebook approach can feel super rigid, almost robotic, like you're just checking boxes. But virtue ethics, it embraces the mess. It understands that life is complex. It demands that we bring our whole selves to the table, our emotional maturity, our practical wisdom, not just a simple list of do's and don'ts. All right, let's bring this down to earth with a concrete example. Let's talk about a virtue like generosity. According to virtue ethics, being a generous person is so much more than just the physical act of giving something away. It goes way, way deeper. See, for a truly generous person, their character is fully integrated. Their perceptions are different. They actually notice the person in need, while someone else might just look the other way. Their thoughts are focused on how they can be helpful. Their motive is genuine compassion, not just some reluctant feeling of, I guess I should do this. And, this part is crucial, they actually take pleasure in helping. It's this whole package that makes them virtuous, not just a single isolated action. Now, this all sounds pretty inspiring, right? But as with any big idea, no theory is perfect. Virtue ethics has faced some very tough criticisms, so let's get into 3 of the biggest ones. All right, problem number 1. It can feel, well, pretty vague. I mean, if you're facing a really tough moral decision, being told to just do what a virtuous person would do might not give you the clear guidance you're looking for. What happens when virtues conflict? What if being honest to one friend means being disloyal to another? The theory doesn't offer a simple tiebreaker. And this leads us to an even more fundamental problem. If this whole system relies on having a moral exemplar to guide us, then who exactly are they? How do we pick them? Let's take Winston Churchill as an example. He's often praised for his incredible courage and leadership, definitely virtues, but he also held deeply racist views. The source material notes he once said he hated Indians and called them a beastly people. So how do you square that? Can someone with such a profound moral failing truly be the role model we should emulate? It just shows how hard it is to find a perfect exemplar. And finally, we get to a classic philosophical chicken or the egg scenario. It's called the priority problem. Think about it. Are actions right because a virtuous person does them? Or is a person virtuous because they consistently do the right things? Which concept is more fundamental, the good person or the right action? Now, virtue ethics has a clear answer here. It insists that virtue comes first. Right actions are just what virtuous people do. But, and this is a huge but, many philosophers argue this gets things completely backwards. They'd say an action, like preventing harm, is right for reasons that have nothing to do with who is performing it. This remains a huge point of debate. So, with all these problems, you might be thinking, is virtue ethics even useful? And the answer is absolutely. Despite the challenges, it brings something essential back into our conversations about what it means to be good. The reality is that no single ethical theory has all the answers. They all have their strengths and weaknesses. But virtue ethics enriches our moral landscape by reminding us that there's more to ethics than just what we do in a single moment. So what are the big takeaways here? First, morality is about who you are, not just what you do. Second, being a good person is a complex skill, something you practice and develop over a lifetime. And third, it reminds us that our character, our wisdom, and even our emotions are all essential parts of living a moral life. And that leaves us with a final question to think about, one for you. When you look for a moral role model, who do you choose? Is it a historical figure, a family member, maybe even a fictional character? And more importantly, what virtues do you see in them that you want to cultivate in yourself?
Let's just jump right in with a quote from, one of the biggest names in Western philosophy, Aristotle. He wrote, "The male is by nature superior and the female inferior. The one rules and the other is ruled." Wow. I mean, to our ears today, that is just a shocking thing to read, and it really sets the stage for what we're talking about.
And look, Aristotle wasn't some kind of outlier. Fast forward centuries and you get another giant, Immanuel Kant, writing that if a woman actually succeeds at laborious learning, it destroys her femininity. These aren't just some fringe opinions, you guys. These are ideas from the absolute core figures who built the foundations of modern ethics. So when you see this kind of deep historical bias baked into the system, you just know there has to be a response, right? A powerful intellectual pushback. And that is exactly what we're going to dive into today. Feminist ethics and its most famous idea, the ethics of care.
But first, to really get why this was so revolutionary, we need to understand what's been called philosophy's woman problem. Because for hundreds and hundreds of years, the whole field of ethics was built on a foundation that had some, let's say, pretty serious cracks. And here's the bottom line. For centuries, the major ethical theories that shaped our world were written almost entirely by men, in societies that actively discriminated against women. And this created two massive problems. First, it meant that the experiences of half the population were just completely ignored. And second, it led to these totally false, damaging claims about women, just like the ones we just saw.
So in response to all this, a totally new approach started to emerge, one that offered a fundamentally different way of thinking about our moral lives. It was time for a new moral compass.
And that brings us to feminist ethics. Now, it's important to know this isn't just one single theory. It's more of a whole approach, and its core mission is pretty simple but profound: to correct that historical failure, to finally take the experiences and perspectives of women seriously, not as a side note, but as a vital piece of the puzzle of what morality even is. So this whole approach is built on four central claims. First, and this was the big one, women are the moral equals of men. Sounds obvious now, right? But it was a huge deal. Second, women's experiences aren't just something to add on later. They are vital to getting a full picture of morality. Third, it says that traits we've traditionally called feminine, like empathy, compassion, care, are at least as morally important as masculine ones like justice and independence. And finally, number 4, it makes the bold claim that traditionally feminine ways of reasoning, being flexible, cooperative, are often superior to rigid, rule-based thinking.
Okay, so let's see how these big ideas get turned into a specific ethical theory that has become incredibly influential. Let's talk about the ethics of care.
All right. Instead of starting with some abstract, high-level principle, the ethics of care start somewhere way more down to earth, the relationship between a parent and a child. Just think about that for a second. That bond isn't governed by some impartial set of rules or a contract. No way. It's built on love, on connection, on this intense personal responsibility for another human being. And that becomes the model for how we should think about all morality.
And this right here, this shows you the fundamental shift in thinking. Traditional theories, they're all about impartial justice. They see emotions as messy distractions, and they focus on abstract rules and rights. The ethics of care just flips the script. Its guiding principle is caring relationships. It sees emotions as a source of moral wisdom, and it focuses on the real, specific needs of the individual people right in front of us.
I mean, this is a complete 180 from someone like Kant, right? He basically saw emotions as a corrupting influence on pure, cold reason. But for care ethicists, emotions like empathy, sympathy, love, they aren't obstacles you have to overcome to be moral. They are the tools you use. I mean, how can you possibly know what's right for someone if you don't feel for them, if you can't put yourself in their shoes?
So, what does this actually look like in the real world? The world that's complicated and messy and doesn't fit into neat little philosophical boxes. Well, this brings us to this core idea, prioritizing our relationships over rigid rules.
So many of the old school theories were obsessed with finding that one supreme moral rule, the one rule to rule them all that could solve any problem. The ethics of care says, nope, that's a pipe dream. It argues that the search for a rule like that is a total dead end. Morality is complicated, it's messy, and the right thing to do always depends on the context and the people involved.
Let's make this super practical. Imagine this. Your parents ask you what you really think about your boyfriend, and they kind of want you to be critical. Now, a simple rule like always tell the truth, well, it's kind of useless here, isn't it? It completely ignores the real harm it could do to your boyfriend, to your relationship with him, to your relationship with your parents. A care ethics approach says the answer isn't in a rule book. You find it by carefully thinking about the needs and feelings of the actual people in this messy situation.
And this all leads to a really important idea that directly challenges traditional ethics: partiality. It's the belief that it is not just okay, but morally good and right to give special priority to the people we care about. We have a stronger moral duty to our own kids or our best friends than we do to complete strangers, precisely because morality grows out of these special, caring connections.
Okay, but no theory is perfect, and it's super important to look at the other side. The ethics of care has faced some really significant challenges and critiques, and we've got to understand those too.
So, critics started asking some really tough questions. For instance, if morality is all about care, does that mean we have zero moral duties to strangers or people in other countries, or even people we just plain don't like? And can we really trust our emotions? We all know feelings can be biased or just plain wrong. And what about a judge or a boss? We want them to be impartial, not to favor their friends. And if we throw out universal rules, how do we ever solve big moral disagreements? And finally, what about justice and rights? Aren't those still a huge, crucial part of living a good life?
So, with all those challenges on the table, what's the ultimate contribution here? Well, it's that this framework invites every single one of us to take a broader, more complete view of what it means to be a moral person.
And let's be absolutely clear about a really common misunderstanding. Feminist ethics is not just some niche ethic for women. That's not the goal at all. The recommendations to value care, to listen to our emotions, to prioritize our relationships, these are intended for everyone, for men and women alike. The hope is to build a richer, more humane moral world for all of us.
This quote just nails it, doesn't it? The whole idea is that by making care the centerpiece, by giving our emotions and our relationships a real seat at the table in our moral thinking, we can actually make a substantial, positive difference in how we see the world and treat each other.
So I'm going to leave you with this final, really tricky thought experiment. You're hiring for a job. Your close friend applies, but honestly, they're less qualified than some of the other candidates. A traditional view would scream, be impartial, hire the best person, period. But an ethic of care suggests you have a special duty to help your friend. So, what do? What does morality demand? There is no easy answer, and that, right there, is exactly the point.
I will fly.